I'll turn to Dr. Wagacha. I understand that you were instrumental in encouraging Africa Investor to establish the AI, African Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Pension Fund Leaders Forum, and the Infrastructure Co-Investment Platform that was launched in September in New York. It naturally addresses the previous summit's recommendation calling for a centralized and facilitated engagement with African asset owners. And what do you think needs to happen to deepen the relations and investment partnerships with the U.S. pension fund community?
Let me say that despite the recommendations which were made in New York, and many of you who are here, who are there, contributed to the thinking, the area is a formative one. And just like the Kenya Sovereign Wealth Fund is a formative fund, it's done well in terms of the framework, in finally getting funding to get moving and to have the architecture done. But the area of these ideas is formative. It means that in many senses, we have to think together and think through areas and impediments, which, for example, Angela has just put on the table. And to me, there's a certain degree of information asymmetry. You have opportunities on the continent in infrastructure, for example, that are high return propositions. But the risk tends to be high. So unless you come across the rare investor who is looking for high risk, high return portfolio, you don't get too many people investing in your high return investments, for example, in infrastructure. And I was reading just this morning the study published in this document, which is in your folio. And it's very interesting that, for example, Africa has the highest sort of risk return profile. And the impediment is that people, unless people want high risk, in the assessment of this report published by AI, they don't come. So you have to have a very high rate of return to get anyone to invest in infrastructure. So to me, then what needs to be, as I repeat from this morning, is a very high concentration of information gathering and dissemination on profitable projects, so that in the domestic arena, if an economy has a high return project, say like in Kenya at the moment, we have a high return project called the LAPSET. Everybody knows the project will change the face of Africa. It will go from a place called Lamu, the infrastructure project, go all the way across Africa to Douala in Cameroon. And investors know that there's a high return. In fact, many have placed their bets on that project. But the risk profile is not well, the information is not well established and well disseminated. Some of my Kenyan colleagues in front can attest to what kind of, they've led some of the thinking. So what we need, I think, is profiling, again, profiling of high-value domestic projects. It's easy to say profiling. If it is the government talking, then Angela might not be, might take a long while to be convinced. If it is a facility that has professionals and a facility that is independent in profiling LAPSET, a domestic project, as I say, it might lower the return risk complementarity, so that you lower the risk and the project will be taken up. So, in a sense, in my view, Chairman, I think what we need is a home for information gathering or information documentation and dissemination, financial information and dissemination of all the ratios needed, all the asset allocation mechanisms, the portfolios, and when that is disseminated at a professional niche that is credible, that has governance issues sorted out, and it is not government, you might then lower these numbers on risk return profiles. The same, Mr. Chairman, applies to regional projects. There are, for example, the one I mentioned, LAPSET, is a regional project. It involves Kenya, it involves Ethiopia, it involves other countries.
South Sudan.
Yes. So, thank you. So you need, so for those, you still need that highly credible, highly reputable facility that disseminates the information. And it's expensive. The weightlifting for that kind of information, as you know, is expensive. The people who know how to profile such projects and produce credible information for investors are expensive people. So it's costly. So to me, I think what you need to get independent assessments and get credible and reputable people to do the job is perhaps to host such a facility within a highly credible institution.
Such as?
So then, Mr. Chairman, let me add my last point. It is not necessarily true that the known universe of portfolios, asset allocations, for example, in New York, applies to Africa. If you're dealing with a continent that has a high appetite or would gain, or where people would advance themselves economically, much more, for example, from concentrating on infrastructure projects, it would be useful and it would be common sense to have an asset class, perhaps called infrastructure projects, so that you float a portfolio that contains an asset, not just equities in general, not just bonds and securities, but an asset class called infrastructure projects, so that this facility would float these propositions of assessments and high-value projects would be floated as a class of assets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think we may come back to where this might be housed later on in the Q&A session.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.